Atlas started barking at the concrete floor before the first truck pulled into the snow-covered lot. Caleb hit the ground the instant the gunshot cracked through the firehouse. Dust rained from the ceiling tiles while Atlas lunged down the dark hallway, growling so hard it echoed through the empty garage. Then Caleb heard metal shifting somewhere beneath the concrete floor, and suddenly understood why somebody wanted this old station erased. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The motel sign outside Caleb Mercer's window buzzed like a dying transformer. Vacancy. Only half the letters worked. The red neon flickered against the wet parking lot in uneven pulses that slipped through the blinds and crawled across the room like distant artillery flashes. Atlas lifted his head every time the light changed. "It's fine," Caleb muttered. The German Shepherd lowered his muzzle back onto his paws but didn't relax. He never fully relaxed anymore. Not since Kandahar. Not since the convoy outside Sangin, where Atlas had dragged Caleb behind a shredded mud wall while rounds cracked over their heads like splitting wood. The motel room smelled like damp carpet and old cigarettes baked into drywall from 20 winters ago. Somewhere nearby, plumbing rattled inside the walls. A television murmured through the room next door. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed with his boots still on, elbows on his knees, staring at the digital clock beside the lamp. 2:17 a.m. He hadn't slept. Again. The smoke detector above the bathroom sink chirped once. A sharp electronic beep. Caleb's body reacted before his mind did. His shoulders locked, pulse spiked. Breath stopped halfway into his chest. Warning tone. Fob perimeter alert. He was back in Helmand for half a second. Dust in his teeth. Sweat under body armor. Someone shouting over radio chatter. Atlas stood immediately. The dog crossed the room in 2 silent steps and pressed against Caleb's leg before the flashback could fully pull him under. Caleb exhaled hard through his nose. "Yeah," he whispered. "I know." The smoke detector chirped again. That was enough. Caleb stood, grabbed the chair beneath the bathroom door, climbed up and twisted the detector loose from the ceiling. The battery came out with a snap. Silence dropped into the room so suddenly it almost rang. Atlas watched him from the doorway. "You happy now?" The dog blinked slowly. Caleb tossed the battery into the sink and sat back down on the bed. The room settled around them again. Outside, tires hissed across wet pavement. Somewhere, farther down the highway, an 18-wheeler groaned through gears, climbing toward the mountain pass. Montana nights had a way of making every sound feel farther away than it really was. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. 43 years old, 2 deployments in Afghanistan, Bronze Star, combat medic. 3 years ago, he'd been training private security contractors outside Billings. Now he had $78.32 folded inside his wallet, beside an expired VA card. He pulled the wallet out anyway, counted the money again even though he already knew the number. 3 20s, a 10, a 5. 3 singles, coins. Atlas shifted toward the door and lay across it sideways, head up, ears forward, guard position. Always the same. Caleb looked at the dog for a long moment. "You know, we're out of options, right?" Atlas thumped his tail once against the carpet. The old shepherd's muzzle had gone gray around the edges over the past year. Scar tissue cut through the fur above his left shoulder, where shrapnel had grazed him during their second deployment. Most people saw a dog. Caleb saw the only living thing that had stayed. Not the army, not his ex-wife, not the job. Atlas. The memory hit him before he could stop it. Loading dock behind the warehouse in Bozeman. Rain, cold air. A truck driver dropping a pallet too hard. Bang. Not a gunshot, just a tire blowout from the trailer axle. But Caleb hit the concrete before he even understood where he was. One hand on the back of his neck, the other reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. Employees screaming, forklift alarms, Atlas barking, and Caleb yelling at ghosts nobody else could see. Security terminated effective immediately. The supervisor wouldn't even look him in the eye afterward. Caleb leaned back against the stained motel wall and closed his eyes. He could still hear rotor blades sometimes when the wind hit power lines a certain way. Still checked rooftops walking into grocery stores, still counted exits, still woke up reaching for people who never came home. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. A pair of headlights swept across the blinds outside. Caleb's eyes opened immediately. The dog didn't bark. That mattered. Barking meant danger. Silence meant observation. Caleb stood and moved toward the window without crossing directly in front of it. Old habits. He used the edge of the blinds to check the parking lot. County sheriff cruiser. Just passing through. The lights disappeared. Only then did Atlas settle again. Caleb grabbed the last can of beef stew from his duffel bag and opened it with a plastic fork. He split it between two paper bowls from the motel microwave shelf. Atlas waited until Caleb nodded once before eating. Outside, snow began drifting through the motel parking lot beneath the broken neon sign. First snow of the season. Caleb watched it fall while he forced down cold stew that tasted mostly like salt and metal. Tomorrow morning he'd have to check out. No money for another night. Truck heater barely worked. Mountain roads would freeze by dark. The realization sat heavy and still inside him. Not panic, worse, the quiet understanding that nobody was coming. Atlas finished eating first and walked over, resting his chin against Caleb's knee. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ear automatically. "You remember Texas?" he asked softly. Atlas stared at him. "Warm nights, real coffee. That waitress who kept sneaking you bacon." The dog's ears twitched. Caleb smiled for maybe half a second before it faded again. He finally stretched out on top of the motel blanket without removing his boots. Atlas stayed by the door. The neon sign buzzed. Snow drifted harder. And somewhere around dawn, exhaustion finally dragged Caleb under. When he woke again, pale gray morning light filled the room. Atlas was already standing alert beside the window. Caleb groaned, neck stiff, and checked the clock. 9:14, checkout time. He splashed cold water on his face, shoved his few belongings into the duffel, and clipped Atlas's leash onto his collar. The motel manager watched them leave from behind cloudy office glass without waving. The air outside bit through Caleb's jacket immediately. His truck started on the third try. The heater coughed weakly as he pulled onto the highway, heading north through Black Hollow County. Pine-covered mountains rose dark against the morning sky. Old mining roads cut across the hillsides like scars. Half the storefronts in the towns they passed were boarded up. At a gas station outside Black Hollow, Caleb stopped to buy coffee with the last of the motel change. Atlas waited beside the truck while Caleb walked toward the station entrance. That's when he saw it. A faded paper pinned crooked beside the community bulletin board. County auction, Saturday abandoned properties. At the very bottom of the list, nearly hidden beneath a flyer for a lost hunting dog, were 4 words that made Caleb stop walking. Former fire station, 14 minimum bid. $1 Atlas let out a low growl behind him. Caleb turned slowly toward the mountains above town. Somewhere up there, hidden among the black pines and old mining roads, stood a fire station nobody wanted. And for reasons he couldn't explain yet, he suddenly couldn't stop thinking about it. The paper trembled slightly beneath the wind coming through the gas station doorway. Former fire station 14. Minimum bid, $1. Caleb read it 3 times while hot coffee burned against his palm through the thin styrofoam cup. Beside him, Atlas stood stiff beside the truck, eyes fixed toward the mountains beyond Black Hollow. The dog's ears had gone forward, not curiosity, attention. The same look he used to get before contact. Caleb folded the flyer carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. "You smell something?" he asked quietly. Atlas didn't move. Snow clouds hung low over the valley as Caleb climbed back into the truck. The engine coughed twice before turning over hard enough to shake the steering wheel. Heat barely pushed from the vents. Black Hollow sat deep between mountains, that looked almost blue beneath the winter sky. Old mining buildings clung to the hillsides above town like rusted skeletons. Conveyor belts crossed empty ravines. Coal tipples stood abandoned beside frozen rail lines nobody used anymore. Everything here looked left behind. Caleb understood places like that. The courthouse sat on Main Street between a boarded pharmacy and a diner with fogged-up windows. A temporary sign outside read, "Counter property auction today." Only a dozen vehicles filled the lot. Small town turnout. Caleb parked near the edge with the nose facing outward automatically. Easier exit, easier line of sight. Atlas climbed out beside him, paws crunching over thin snow while Caleb scanned the street before approaching the building. 2 exits. One deputy near the front door. Older man smoking beside a pickup across the street. No immediate problems. Still, his shoulders stayed tight. Inside, the courthouse smelled like wet wool and burnt coffee. Folding chairs filled the center aisle beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. About 20 people sat scattered around the room wearing heavy coats and work boots. Most of them looked local enough to know each other. The room quieted slightly when Caleb walked in with Atlas. People always looked at the dog first. A shepherd that size drew attention fast. Atlas stayed close against Caleb's leg, silent and disciplined, nails clicking softly against old tile floor. Caleb chose the last chair near the wall, where he could see every entrance without turning his head. Habit. A woman in her 70s sat 2 seats away wearing a dark green coat buttoned to her throat. She glanced once at Atlas, then at Caleb's face. "You military?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. "Used to be." She looked toward the mountains through the courthouse window. "Lotta ghosts up there." Before Caleb could answer, the county clerk stepped to the front, holding a stack of papers. "All right," he said. "We'll begin with parcel 6. The auction moved slowly. Vacant lots, storage sheds, a collapsed trailer outside county lines. Most sold cheap to the same 3 or 4 bidders barely paying attention." Caleb listened without hearing much. His focus drifted instead toward the folded flyer in his pocket. Former Fire Station 14. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the back corner of the courthouse. A man stood there near the radiator, mid-50s, heavy coat, gray beard, watching Caleb too closely. The moment their eyes met, the man looked away. Caleb felt the old tightening in his chest. Observation, assessment. Years overseas had burned certain instincts into his nervous system so deeply, they no longer felt like thoughts. Something about the man bothered him. The clerk cleared his throat again. "Final property today," he announced. "Former Fire Station number 14, located on County Ridge Road. Structure condemned following closure in 2011. Property sold as is. Minimum bid $1. Silence. Nobody moved. Even the men who'd bid on everything else kept their hands down. Somebody near the front muttered, "Damn place ought to stay buried." A nervous laugh moved through the room and died quickly. The older woman beside Caleb leaned closer without looking directly at him. "That place should stayed closed," she whispered. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Caleb glanced around the room. No bids, no movement. Just people waiting for the moment to pass. He thought about the motel, the empty wallet, the coming snow. Atlas shifted against his leg, staring toward the courthouse doors. Now, like he wanted out, a roof was still a roof, even a ruined one. Caleb raised his hand. The clerk blinked. $1 from the gentleman in the back. "Any advance?" "Nothing, not one." Voice. The room had gone strangely still. "Going once," the clerk said. Atlas let out a low growl. Heads turned immediately. The shepherd's eyes locked toward the rear hallway beyond the radiator. The gray-bearded man from earlier was gone. Caleb scanned the room automatically. No movement, no open door. Nobody should been able to leave that fast. Going twice. The older woman beside Caleb crossed herself quietly. Sold. The sound of the gavel cracked through the courthouse. For half a second, Caleb's pulse jumped hard enough to remind him of rifle fire echoing through concrete compounds overseas. Atlas pressed against his knee immediately, grounding him. Caleb exhaled slowly. The clerk motioned him forward to sign paperwork. The deed transfer fit on 2 thin sheets of paper that looked too small to carry the weight of an entire building. "You understand the property's condemned?" the clerk asked, while sliding over a ring with 2 old brass keys. "I understand." "No utilities. County won't cover liability issues. Access road may not be plowed." Caleb signed anyway. The clerk hesitated before handing over the keys. "You planning on staying there?" "For a while." The man studied him carefully, then lowered his voice. "People hear things up there at night." Caleb almost smiled. People said that in Afghanistan too. Outside, snow had started falling harder. Atlas stepped onto the courthouse stairs and stopped cold. Every muscle in the shepherd's body tightened. Then came the growl. Low, deep, dangerous. Caleb turned instantly. At the far end of Main Street, parked beneath a dead traffic light, sat a black SUV with tinted windows. Engine running, watching. The moment Caleb looked directly at it, the SUV rolled away slowly toward the northern road leading into the mountains. Atlas kept staring long after it disappeared. Caleb looked down at the brass keys resting in his palm. Former fire station 14, $1. And somehow it already felt like he'd stepped into something waiting for him long before he arrived. The road up County Ridge looked less like a road and more like something the mountain had tried to reclaim. Snow covered the cracked asphalt in uneven patches. Pine branches leaned low over the truck, scraping across the roof with long, dry whispers. Rusted guardrails appeared and disappeared along sharp drop-offs that vanished into black timber below. Caleb drove slowly with both hands tight on the wheel. Atlas sat upright in the passenger's seat, staring through the windshield without blinking. No radio, no music. Only the truck engine climbing the mountain and the occasional hiss of snow under old tires. About 4 miles above Black Hollow, Caleb spotted the firehouse for the first time through the trees. It stood alone against the mountain's side. Brick, steel, dark windows. The building looked enormous compared to the empty road leading to it, like something built for a town that no longer existed. The old station sat behind a chain-link fence half buried in snowdrifts. One gate hung crooked on a broken hinge. Faded white letters still clung to the garage doors. Black Hollow Fire and Rescue. Station 14. The final 2 numbers had nearly peeled away. Atlas growled softly before the truck even stopped moving. Caleb killed the engine. Silence dropped over the mountain instantly. No traffic, no voices. Just wind moving through pine trees somewhere above them. The kind of silence that made small sounds feel dangerous. Caleb stepped out first and scanned automatically. Tree line, roof line, windows, movement, nothing. But the back of his neck still tightened anyway. Atlas jumped down beside him and immediately began circling the perimeter of the building nose first, moving with the same methodical pattern he used during old canine sweeps overseas. Clear left, pause, check corner, advance. Caleb watched him go. "You seeing something I'm not?" Atlas ignored him and continued toward the rear of the station. The front bay doors stood partially open, frozen several feet above the ground where the tracks had jammed years ago. Caleb ducked beneath one carefully, flashlight already in hand before he realized he'd drawn it. Inside smelled like cold ash and wet concrete. The beam from the flashlight cut across the garage floor, dust, collapsed ceiling tiles, oil stains black as old blood. A fire engine sat against the far wall beneath a tarp eaten through by mold and mice. One tire had collapsed completely under the weight. Rust streaked down the chrome bumper like dried tears. Caleb moved deeper into the station slowly. The flashlight stayed low and steady. Never telegraph your position. Never silhouette yourself in a doorway. The habits lived inside him now deeper than thought. Wind whistled through broken side windows somewhere upstairs. Metal creaked softly overhead. Atlas appeared near the hallway entrance and stopped. His ears went high. Then he walked forward again. The hallway beyond the garage led deeper into darkness. Dorm rooms lined one side. A kitchen occupied the other. Most of the doors hung partly open. Caleb checked each room instinctively. Clear, clear, clear. One room still held metal bunk frames bolted to the floor. Another contained old turnout gear hanging inside open lockers, covered in dust thick enough to soften footsteps. The kitchen sink was frozen solid. Cabinets stood open and empty. Somebody had left in a hurry years ago. That feeling settled heavier the farther Caleb walked. Not abandonment. Interruption. Atlas suddenly froze near the end of the hallway. His body stiffened hard enough that Caleb noticed immediately. The dog stared toward a final set of lockers near the rear wall. Then came the low growl. Caleb turned off the flashlight instinctively. Darkness swallowed the hallway. He listened, nothing. Only wind. But Atlas stayed locked on the lockers, like someone stood there breathing. Caleb waited almost a full minute before clicking the flashlight back on. Empty. Still, he felt his pulse picking up. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The same tension before entering compounds overseas where everything looked quiet until it wasn't. Atlas walked closer to the lockers and sniffed along the concrete floor, then stopped. His paw scraped once against the ground. Caleb frowned. What is it? The dog pawed harder this time. Scrape. Scrape. Concrete dust scattered beneath his claws. Caleb crouched beside him. The floor looked normal except for faint drag marks beneath years of grime. Parallel lines disappearing underneath the row of steel lockers bolted against the wall. Something about it bothered him immediately. The wall behind the lockers looked slightly different from the surrounding brick. Different shade, different mortar, newer. Atlas let out another low sound in his throat. Then somewhere outside, bang! Caleb hit the floor instantly. Flashlight out, back against wall, heart hammering. Atlas crouched beside him, ready to lunge. 3 seconds passed before Caleb realized what it actually was. A loose sign outside slamming against metal in the wind. Not gunfire, not incoming, just wind. His breathing stayed rough anyway. The hallway around him faded for half a second, and Hellman crashed back instead. Dust storm, gunfire, medic screaming for a tourniquet, radio static, the metallic taste of adrenaline. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut hard. Not there, he muttered under his breath. You're not there. Atlas nudged his arm immediately, grounding him again. The shepherd pressed close enough for Caleb to feel warmth through his jacket's sleeve. Slowly, the mountain returned, the hallway, the lockers, the cold, Montana. Not Afghanistan. Caleb stayed crouched another moment before forcing himself upright. Hell of a place, he whispered. Outside, snow fell harder against broken windows. Daylight was already fading blue through the trees. Even though it wasn't late yet, mountain winter, dark came fast here. Caleb cleared a corner of the garage near an old tool cabinet and unrolled his sleeping bag beside the wall. Atlas paced the station 3 more times before finally settling near the entrance to the hallway. Watching, always watching. Caleb ate crackers from an emergency ration pack while snow hammered the roof overhead. No power, no heat. Just darkness creeping deeper through the station inch by inch. By full nightfall, the mountain outside had vanished entirely. Only black windows remained. The firehouse groaned occasionally as wind moved through the structure. Pipes rattled somewhere inside the walls. Caleb slept lightly with one hand near the combat knife tucked beside his bedroll. Years of war had taught him real sleep was temporary. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Atlas exploded upward. A vicious bark shattered the darkness. Caleb woke instantly, knife already in hand before his eyes fully opened. The shepherd stood rigid at the hallway entrance, barking toward the rear lockers. Not random barking. Alert barking, focused, aggressive. Caleb grabbed the flashlight and moved forward fast but controlled. No wasted movement. The beam bounced across walls and broken tile as he advanced down the hallway. Atlas was already there. Claws tearing against concrete, scraping, digging. The dog attacked the floor beneath the lockers so hard sparks jumped from his nails. Atlas! The shepherd ignored him completely. Blood appeared along one claw where the concrete split skin back to the quick. Still he kept digging. Then Caleb heard it. A sound underneath the floor, not loud. Just faint enough to make his stomach tighten. A hollow metallic echo beneath solid concrete. Caleb slowly lowered the flashlight toward the base of the lockers. And for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, he realized the firehouse might actually be hiding something. Atlas finally stopped clawing long enough to back away from the lockers, chest heaving. One paw lifted slightly off the ground. Blood spotted the dusty concrete beneath him. Caleb crouched immediately. Easy, let me see. Atlas resisted at first, still staring toward the wall, low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Caleb rested one hand against the shepherd's neck until the dog finally relented enough for him to inspect the paw. Split nail, nothing broken. Caleb cleaned it with bottled water from his pack, while the firehouse groaned softly around them. The hollow sound beneath the concrete stayed in his head. He looked back toward the lockers. 6 steel lockers welded together into one long row, bolted directly into the floor. Rust had eaten through most of the paint, but the bases looked strangely cleaner than the surrounding concrete. Recently disturbed. Not recently enough to notice at first glance, but recently enough for someone trained to look. Caleb stood and swept the flashlight across the rear wall again. Brick everywhere else in the station. But behind the lockers, cinder block, different mortar, different age. Atlas whined softly beside him. Caleb reached out and pressed his palm against the blocks. Cold, far colder than the brick around it. His stomach tightened. Airflow very faint. But there, something sat behind that wall. The wind outside slammed snow against broken windows harder now. The storm had fully settled into the mountains. No chance of working tonight. Caleb looked down at Atlas. We wait till morning. The dog didn't seem happy about it. Neither was Caleb. He barely slept after that. Every creak of the building dragged him awake. Once, around 4 a.m., he heard what sounded like footsteps overhead and spent 10 minutes clearing the upper loft with flashlight and knife before realizing loose ductwork was swinging in the wind. By dawn, exhaustion sat behind his eyes like gravel. Snow covered half the bay doors when he stepped outside with Atlas the next morning. The mountains surrounding Black Hollow had disappeared into white fog. Smoke curled from chimneys far below in town. Atlas headed straight for the rear hallway again the second they re-entered the station. Still focused, still alerting. Caleb made coffee over a small propane burner near the garage wall and stared toward the lockers while steam drifted into the freezing air. Something behind that wall. And somehow the thought bothered him less than it should have. Maybe because, after years overseas, strange hidden things stopped feeling unusual. Sometimes the most dangerous rooms were the ones somebody worked hardest to conceal. An hour later, Caleb drove back down into town for tools. Black Hollow looked different in daylight, less haunted, more tired. The hardware store sat near the end of Main Street, beneath a faded wooden sign that read Dawson Hardware and Feed. A rusted bell jingled overhead when Caleb stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Motor oil, sawdust, old, coffee. The place looked untouched since 1987. Shelves crowded with hunting gear, chains, paint cans, snow boots, propane fittings. A wood stove crackled near the register. An older man stood behind the counter rebuilding what looked like a carburetor. Gray beard, heavy shoulders, Vietnam veteran hat. The man looked up once at Caleb, then down at Atlas. Dogs got discipline, he said. Caleb nodded slightly. So do you. The man set the carburetor down carefully. You military? Army? What unit? Caleb hesitated automatically. Old habit. Attached medical support. The man grunted once like he understood more than Caleb had actually said. I'm Hank Dawson. Caleb. Hank's eyes drifted briefly to the way Caleb stood near the doorway without realizing it. Weight balanced, clear sightline to exits, never fully relaxed. You still clear rooms before entering them, Hank said casually. Caleb said nothing. That was answer enough. Hank pointed toward the back aisle. Tools are that way. Caleb grabbed a pry bar, heavy-duty socket wrench, penetrating oil and work gloves. Atlas followed close beside him, nails ticking softly across old wooden floorboards. At checkout, Hank looked over the items. Firehouse, he asked. Caleb glanced up sharply. How'd you know? Town only talks about one thing at a time. Hank rang up the tools slowly. Right now, it's the stranger dumb enough to buy Station 14. People seem nervous about that place. Hank's expression flattened slightly. Used to volunteer there myself. That caught Caleb's attention. Hank noticed. Long time ago, he added. The old man slid the pry bar across the counter. You staying there alone, me and Atlas? Hank looked down at the dog again. Atlas stared back without blinking. Then Hank lowered his voice slightly. If that shepherd starts warning you about something, he paused. Listen to him. Outside, snow drifted sideways through town when Caleb loaded the tools into the truck. Halfway back up the mountain, he noticed tire tracks behind him. Dark pickup. 2 vehicles back, keeping distance. The same truck stayed behind him for nearly 3 miles before turning off suddenly near an abandoned mining road. Caleb watched it disappear in the mirror. No company logos. No plates visible through snow. His pulse stayed elevated the rest of the drive. By the time he reached the firehouse, daylight had already started fading behind the mountains again. Atlas jumped from the truck and immediately trotted toward the rear hallway. No hesitation. Straight to the lockers. Caleb sprayed penetrating oil over every rusted bolt, anchoring the lockers to the floor. The metal squealed beneath the wrench as he leaned his weight against it. Nothing. He adjusted grip, pulled harder. Crack. The first bolt finally broke loose. Atlas barked sharply. Excited now. The second bolt came easier, then the third. Dust drifted through flashlight beams, while the storm deepened outside. Piece by piece, Caleb dismantled the welded locker row until finally only the last section remained against the wall. His breathing fogged the freezing air. Atlas stood beside him, trembling with anticipation. Caleb wedged the pry bar beneath the final locker base and shoved hard. Metal screamed across concrete. The locker shifted sideways several inches, and behind it, a steel door painted dark red. The word stamped across it had almost faded away completely beneath rust and time. Chief only. Atlas let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not fear. Recognition. Caleb stepped closer slowly. The steel handle sat untouched beneath years of dust, and right below it, fresh scrape marks. Somebody else had tried to open it before. Caleb crouched beside the steel door and ran the flashlight beam across the lock plate. The scratches were recent, not years old. The metal still showed silver beneath the gouges where something sharp had slipped against it. Pry marks. Atlas stood rigid beside him, ears forward, tail low. The dog wouldn't take his eyes off the darkness beyond the door. Caleb tested the handle carefully. Locked. He pressed one ear lightly against the steel. Nothing. No movement. No sound except the distant groan of wind outside pushing snow against the firehouse walls. Still, something about the room behind the door felt occupied. Not physically, but intentionally. Like somebody had closed it for a reason. Caleb stepped back slowly and reached for the pry bar. The old steel groaned the moment pressure hit the frame. Rust cracked loose in flakes. The lock held at first. Then came a sharp metallic snap. The door jerked inward 2 inches. A breath of cold air rolled out carrying the smell of old paper, machine oil, and dust sealed away for years. Atlas immediately backed away. That stopped Caleb cold. The shepherd had followed him through mortar fire, burning vehicles, and collapsed compounds overseas without hesitation. But now Atlas stood at the hallway entrance, refusing to cross the threshold. The dog gave a low, uneasy whine. Caleb glanced at him. "You're really not liking this room." Atlas looked away toward the dark hallway behind them, then back to the open door, watching both, guarding. Caleb pushed the steel door wider. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the hidden office, and the room appeared almost untouched by time. Dust coated every surface in pale gray layers, but otherwise the office looked frozen exactly the way someone left it. Metal desk, old rotary radio set, maps pinned across corkboards, photographs covering the walls. A coffee mug still sitting beside a stack of paperwork. The room felt strangely warmer than the hallway outside, protected somehow from the mountain cold. Caleb stepped inside carefully. Floor solid, corners clear, no secondary exits visible. The flashlight drifted over framed photographs lining the wall. Volunteer firefighters, parades, rescue crews. Smiling faces in old turnout gear, standing beside engines, polished bright enough to reflect sunlight. Black hollow before the mines collapsed, before the town started dying. A nameplate sat on the desk beneath years of dust. Chief Walter Byrne. Caleb wiped dust from the surface with one sleeve. Atlas remained outside the room, still refusing to enter. The radio on the shelf caught Caleb's attention next. Old analog emergency frequency set. Military green modifications bolted crudely onto civilian hardware. Somebody had customized it. A habit Caleb recognized immediately. Combat zones taught men how to improvise equipment that survived bad conditions. The same instinct existed here. Pinned beside the radio sat a map of Black Hollow County, marked with circles in red pencil. Old mine tunnels, logging roads, emergency access routes through the mountains. Some markings looked newer than others. Caleb frowned slightly. Chief Byrne had kept working in here long after the station closed. A leather-bound journal rested near the center of the desk. The cover cracked softly when Caleb opened it. Inside, neat handwriting filled page after page. Training schedules, weather reports, equipment inventories. Then scattered between routine entries. Other notes, different, personal. March 14, fund balance transferred. April 2, the boy would be 16 now. September 18, if he ever comes back, everything stays here. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The boy. The phrase appeared again and again through the journal, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. Atlas let out another soft whine from the doorway. Caleb looked up instinctively. The shepherd stared toward the garage now. Listening, Caleb held still. There. A faint sound outside. Crunch. Snow under tires. He killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the room. Years of deployment took over before thought caught up. No silhouette, no unnecessary movement. He moved silently to the side of the doorway and listened. Engine noise, low idle, vehicle outside the station. Atlas gave one deep warning growl, then silence again. Caleb waited nearly 30 seconds before risking a glance through the office blinds. Headlights moved slowly across the snow outside the garage bay. Black SUV, same one from town. The vehicle stopped near the fence line for several long seconds. Engine idling, watching the firehouse. Caleb stayed perfectly still in the darkness. The SUV finally rolled backward and disappeared into the falling snow. Only then did Caleb breathe again. Atlas relaxed slightly but still watched the hallway. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "I saw it." He closed the office door halfway before returning to the desk. The journal pages continued deeper into stranger territory. October 11, Crowley asking questions again. October 14, sprinkler issue unresolved. October 14, later, God forgive us. Caleb froze. October 14. Same date repeated several times afterward in shakier handwriting. Then suddenly, newspaper clippings. Folded carefully between pages. He unfolded the first one beneath the flashlight beam. School fire kills. 2 local heroes. The article showed smoke pouring from a burning elementary school while firefighters carried children through shattered windows. Below the image were photographs of the victims, a man and woman standing together in turnout gear. The second Caleb saw the man's face, his chest tightened hard enough to hurt. Same jaw, same eyes, same crooked scar near the eyebrow, older but unmistakable. Caleb stared at the photograph without blinking. The room seemed to narrow around him. His pulse slowed strangely instead of speeding up, like shock settling into the body too quietly. Beneath the photograph, printed in faded newspaper ink, were the names Daniel Mercer, Evelyn Mercer. Atlas suddenly stepped halfway into the room for the first time, just enough to press against Caleb's leg, grounding him before the memories could fully drag him under. Caleb swallowed once, then looked again at the article. Survived by infant son. Caleb's flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. He barely noticed. Outside, wind slammed snow against the firehouse windows, while somewhere deep in the mountain the old building groaned softly around them. And for the first time in 43 years, Caleb Mercer was staring directly at the faces of his parents. The flashlight beam trembled across the newspaper clipping. Daniel Mercer, Evelyn Mercer. The names felt unfamiliar and deeply personal at the same time, like hearing a language he should remembered, but didn't. Atlas leaned harder against his leg. Caleb stared at the photograph again. His father stood beside a fire engine, wearing turnout gear, streaked with soot, one arm wrapped around Evelyn's shoulders. His mother smiled straight at the camera, with tired eyes and wind-blown hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Neither of them looked like heroes. They looked real. That somehow hurt more. Caleb sat slowly in Chief Burns' chair without taking his eyes off the clipping. Dust shifted beneath him. The old office creaked softly around the storm outside. He tried to remember anything. A voice, a face, a smell. Nothing came. Just fragments, a woman humming somewhere, warm hands lifting him, the distant sound of a siren. Or maybe he was inventing all of it now, because he needed something to belong to. The journal lay open beneath the flashlight. Caleb forced himself to keep reading. October 14, 2008. School fire started at 11:42 a.m. Second floor trapped before county tanker arrived. Daniel entered East Hallway without air support. Evelyn stayed behind to evacuate children through cafeteria windows. 11 survived, 3 teachers injured. No survivors found inside stairwell collapse. Caleb swallowed hard. The words blurred slightly before sharpening again. Outside, wind slammed against the station hard enough to rattle old glass somewhere down the hallway. Atlas finally stepped fully into the office. Slowly, carefully. The shepherd circled once beside the desk before lying directly against Caleb's boots, like he understood something important had shifted. Caleb kept reading. Chief Burns' handwriting changed after the fire. Neater, at first controlled. Then increasingly uneven over the following pages. Met with county investigators. Crowley refusing inspection access. Sprinkler maintenance records missing. Insurance payout approved too quickly. The flashlight paused. Crowley, same name from earlier. October 27. The fire wasn't an accident. Caleb sat motionless. Somewhere deep in his chest, something cold unfolded. Not grief. Not yet. Suspicion. Combat had taught him that instincts arrived before understanding. Sometimes your body recognized danger, long before your mind caught up. He turned another page. No official report filed. Too many people depending on mining contracts. Town council pushing closure. Walter Byrne had underlined the next sentence, so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper. Daniel knew something was wrong before they entered the building. Caleb frowned. His pulse began climbing again. Another page. Daniel reported sprinkler failure during prior inspection. Complaint ignored. Then another. Crowley shut the discussion down personally. A sharp ringing suddenly filled Caleb's ears. Not real. Memory. Alarm tones. Emergency sirens overlapping with shouted radio calls. His breathing shortened automatically. The office disappeared for half a second. Kandahar, dust cloud rolling across a shattered road. A burning mrap. Someone screaming for a medic, blood-soaking gloves. Caleb's right hand tightened around nothing, like it still expected a rifle sling there. Atlas immediately pushed upward against him, hard enough to shake the chair. The shepherd whined once. Grounding signal. Caleb blinked hard. The office returned slowly around him. The maps, the desk, the old photographs. Montana, not Afghanistan. He pressed both palms flat against the desk until the shaking eased. "You're okay," he muttered quietly, though he wasn't sure whether he meant himself or the dog. Atlas rested his head against Caleb's knee. The old shepherd stayed there while Caleb forced air slowly back into his lungs. Snow hissed against the windows. Minutes passed before he could continue reading. Toward the back of the journal, Walter Burns' entries became more personal. "I tried to find the boy. County records sealed. State transferred him twice before age 6. No surviving relatives. I failed, Daniel." Caleb stared at that line for a long moment. Then another page caught his eye. Taped carefully inside the journal was a faded photograph. A toddler sitting on the hood of a fire truck wearing a child-sized yellow plastic helmet, too large for his head. Caleb froze. On the back, written in blue ink, "Caleb, Summer Cookout, Station 14. Age 2. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Not from sadness, from absence. 43 years of life. And this was the first photograph he'd ever seen of himself as a child. Atlas lifted his head suddenly. Low growl. Caleb reacted immediately. Flashlight off. Silence. Then a faint crunch outside the station. Snow under boots. Not wind this time. Movement. Caleb stood slowly and crossed toward the office blinds without exposing himself directly to the window. Military instincts took over completely now. Observe first. Move second. Outside, snow drifted across the lot beneath weak moonlight. At first, he saw nothing. Then movement near the garage bay. A figure. Dark coat. Flashlight beam flickering low near the building foundation. Whoever it was moved carefully. Not random. Searching, Atlas' growl deepened. The figure suddenly stopped. Like they sensed something too. Caleb stayed perfectly still behind the blinds. The stranger angled the flashlight briefly toward the rear side of the station, toward the garage floor beneath the bay. Then a voice drifted faintly through the storm. "Find the basement before he does." Another voice answered somewhere out of sight. Then both flashlight beams disappeared into the trees. Caleb's pulse kicked hard. Basement. He looked slowly back toward the journal on Burns' desk, then toward the hallway where Atlas had first started clawing the concrete. The firehouse wasn't just hiding memories. It was hiding something people were still looking for. Caleb stayed frozen beside the office blinds, long after the flashlight beams disappeared into the trees. Snow drifted sideways across the mountain lot, erasing footprints almost as fast as they formed. The station groaned softly around him like an old ship, settling deeper into cold water. Atlas stood absolutely still beside the desk, listening. The shepherd's ears tracked something Caleb couldn't hear yet. Then came the faint sound of an engine turning over downhill. A pickup, leaving slowly. Caleb waited another full minute before moving. Patience kept people alive overseas. Most mistakes happened after the first moment of relief. He finally stepped away from the window and crossed back toward the desk. His eyes drifted once more over the newspaper clipping of Daniel and Evelyn Mercer before landing on the final line in Burns' journal. "Protect the boy." The old chief had known something dangerous enough to hide, and somebody else clearly knew it too. Caleb shut the journal carefully. Atlas immediately moved toward the hallway. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "I know." The shepherd led him back through the dark corridor toward the rear lockers. The mountain storm had intensified outside. Wind rattled loose metal somewhere on the roof, with sharp, irregular bangs that kept trying to drag Caleb back into old combat reflexes. Every sudden sound still hit his nervous system first and his thoughts second. At the locker room, Atlas stopped again over the same section of concrete floor. Caleb crouched beside him with the flashlight. The drag marks beneath the lockers made more sense now. Somebody had moved them before, recently, and now strangers were searching for a basement. He swept the beam slowly across the floor. That's when he noticed the scrape line, very thin, almost invisible beneath dust. A square outline cut into the concrete several feet beyond the lockers near the old garage wall. Caleb's pulse ticked upward. "Hatch!" he whispered. Atlas barked once sharply. Then suddenly, headlights. Bright beams exploded through the front bay windows. Atlas spun instantly toward the garage, growling deep enough to vibrate through the hallway floor. Caleb killed the flashlight and moved fast. No panic, no wasted motion. The old training slid back into place like muscle memory. He pulled Atlas behind the engine bay wall and peered carefully around the edge toward the front of the station. A pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot. Not the black SUV this time. Older Chevy, mud tires, 2 men inside. The truck stopped near the open bay doors, but the engine stayed running. Caleb watched silhouettes move behind the windshield. Neither man got out immediately, observing first. Same as him, that bothered him more than anything else. These weren't drunk locals looking for trouble. These men were careful. Atlas stayed low beside Caleb's leg, muscles tight and ready. The passenger door finally opened. Heavy boots hit snow. One man stepped out, carrying a flashlight. The second followed a moment later. Both wore hunting jackets and knit caps pulled low over their faces, no visible weapons. But Caleb noticed how they spread out automatically instead of walking side by side. Searching pattern. The first flashlight beam swept across the garage interior. "Anybody here?" one voice called. Caleb stayed silent. The second man moved toward the side entrance. Atlas let out a low warning growl. The sound echoed faintly through the station. The men stopped immediately. The flashlight snapped toward the hallway. "There's somebody inside," one muttered. Caleb's breathing slowed instead of quickened. Combat had burned strange calm into him during bad moments. The worse things got, the quieter his mind became. He pulled a small inspection mirror from his duffel pack beside the wall and angled it carefully around the corner. One man, advancing slowly, the other hanging back near the truck, coordinating. Atlas stared directly at the closer intruder now. Waiting, the man reached the hallway entrance and raised the flashlight higher. That was when Atlas exploded forward. The shepherd launched from darkness like a missile. The man shouted in shock as 90 pounds of German shepherd slammed into his chest. Both crashed sideways against a locker hard enough to shake the wall. The second man reacted instantly. A gunshot cracked through the station. The sound detonated inside Caleb's skull. For half a second, Montana vanished. Helmand, incoming fire, dust, blood, men screaming over radio chatter. Caleb hit the floor automatically and dragged Atlas behind the engine block, while another flashlight beam swung wildly through darkness. Atlas yelped, not loud, but enough. Caleb's stomach dropped cold. The shepherd stumbled beside him, growling viciously, despite the dark stain spreading across his shoulder fur. The first intruder scrambled backward, yelling curses. "Let's go! Go!" Boots pounded across concrete, truck doors slammed. The pickup fishtailed through snow outside as the engine roared downhill into darkness. Silence crashed back into the station almost immediately afterward. Only wind remained, and Atlas breathing hard beside him. Caleb dropped to both knees instantly. Hey, stay with me." Blood soaked through the shepherd's shoulder, but not in heavy pulses. Good, not arterial. Caleb's medic instincts took over automatically. He tore open an old trauma kit from his duffel bag and pressed gauze firmly against the wound, while Atlas trembled beneath his hands. "You're okay," Caleb said quietly. "You're okay." The dog tried to stand again immediately, still guarding, still looking toward the entrance despite pain. Caleb swallowed hard against the tightness building in his throat. "Easy, buddy." Atlas whined softly but didn't fight him. Outside, snow kept falling over the mountain while Caleb cleaned the wound beneath flashlight glow. The bullet had grazed through muscle high on the shoulder. Painful. Bloody. But survivable, thank God. Atlas finally lowered his head against Caleb's knee once the bandage tightened around the wound. That's when Caleb heard it. Very faint. Almost lost beneath the storm. Metal shifting somewhere under the garage floor. Caleb looked slowly toward the concrete hatch outline near the wall. And suddenly one sentence from outside replayed clearly in his mind. "Find the basement before he does." The firehouse had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Snow muffled the entire mountain outside, swallowing every sound except the occasional groan of wind against the old station walls. Caleb sat on the concrete floor beside Atlas with one hand resting lightly against the shepherd's ribs, feeling each breath rise and fall beneath the bandage. The dog finally slept sometime near dawn. Not deeply. Every few minutes one ear twitched toward the garage. Still guarding, Caleb never slept at all. He sat against the engine bay wall with Burns' journal open across one knee, and the pistol he'd taken from his truck resting beside him. The old combat instincts were fully awake now. Whoever came to the firehouse knew about the hidden room, and they knew about the basement. The word itself bothered him. Basements in old mountain buildings usually meant storage, storm shelters, coal rooms, but the men outside hadn't searched randomly. They came directly to the station after Caleb discovered the office. That meant somebody had been watching. The sky beyond the bay doors slowly turned pale gray. Morning. Atlas lifted his head first. The shepherd winced slightly from the shoulder wound, but still pushed himself upright before Caleb could stop him. "Easy." Atlas ignored him and limped toward the garage floor near the old drag marks, straight to the square outline hidden in the concrete. Caleb grabbed the flashlight and followed. The outline became easier to see in daylight, filtering through broken windows. About 6 feet across, thin metal edges hidden beneath decades of grime. A hatch. Ats sniffed along one corner and pawed once. Metal answered beneath the concrete dust. Caleb crouched lower. There. A recessed finger pull nearly invisible under rust and dirt. He wedged the pry bar into the seam and pulled hard. Nothing. Again. The metal groaned faintly but stayed shut, frozen shut for years. Caleb sprayed penetrating oil into the seam and waited while Atlas paced nervously nearby. Then he pulled again with both hands. This time the hatch jerked upward 2 inches before stopping with a deep metallic thud. Cold air rushed out immediately. Not mountain air. Different. Stale. Underground. Atlas backed away, whining softly. Caleb aimed the flashlight downward. Steel ladder. Concrete shaft disappearing into darkness. The beam stopped nearly 15 feet below on another floor. A bunker. His pulse climbed slowly. Jesus! The station above suddenly felt much larger than before, like only part of it had ever been visible. Caleb grabbed a wool coat, flashlight, and spare batteries before descending carefully into the shaft. Atlas followed despite the pain in his shoulder, moving slowly but refusing to stay behind. The bunker smelled like dust, diesel fuel, and old paper sealed underground for decades. Concrete walls, heavy support beams, rows of emergency shelves lining the far side. Cold War-era fallout shelter. The realization came immediately from the faded government markings still visible on supply crates. Black Hollow Civil Defense. The flashlight swept farther. Generator. Fuel drums, radio equipment, file cabinets, and against the rear wall, stacks of cardboard archive boxes, perfectly preserved. Caleb moved deeper into the bunker slowly. The place felt untouched, not abandoned, stored, as if somebody expected these records to matter someday. Atlas limped beside him until reaching the back wall, where he stopped again beside a metal filing cabinet. The shepherd sat heavily there, exhausted now, watching Caleb instead of the room. Caleb pulled open the top drawer. Inside sat rows of folders labeled with years, insurance records, inspection reports, town council meeting transcripts. His flashlight paused on one folder thicker than the others. Maple Street Elementary, 2008. Caleb's chest tightened. He opened it carefully. Inside were photographs from the fire investigation, burn patterns, collapsed stairwell images, maintenance reports, and one page highlighted heavily in red marker, sprinkler system, offline prior to incident. Recommended immediate repair denied pending budget approval. Approved by Mason Crowley. Senior Caleb stared at the signature Crowley. Again, more documents followed. Insurance correspondence, county payment transfers, construction contracts tied to rebuilding efforts after the fire. Money moved everywhere after 11 children survived and 2 firefighters died. Too much money. Then Caleb found the videotapes. Old security tapes sealed inside evidence bags. School basement camera feeds. Byrne had hidden them here. A note clipped to the top read, "Do not trust county storage." Caleb swallowed slowly. The flashlight drifted across another folder marked private. Inside sat newspaper clippings about Black Hollow's economic collapse after the mines shut down. Buried beneath them were handwritten notes from Byrne. Crowley knew the sprinkler system failed weeks before the fire. Daniel threatened to report him. 3 days later, the school burned. Caleb leaned back against the filing cabinet hard enough to shake dust from the shelves. Atlas whined softly beside him. The bunker suddenly felt colder. Not physically, morally. He flipped through more pages until one final document slid loose into his lap.
Single sheet.
Typed, unsigned. "If anything happens to me, protect Daniel's son." Caleb stared at the sentence for a very long time. The bunker hummed softly around him beneath the mountain, while snowstorm winds moved far overhead through the buried ventilation shafts. Someone had known. Someone had spent years hiding all of this, and someone else was still trying to make sure nobody ever found it. Then Atlas growled. Low, immediate. Caleb killed the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the bunker. A sound drifted faintly from above. Footsteps, inside the firehouse. Caleb froze in complete darkness beneath the station while Atlas rose painfully to his feet beside him. A low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The footsteps above moved slowly, carefully. Not random creaks from the old building settling. Someone was walking, room to room. Caleb reached instinctively for the pistol beside his leg and listened. One set of footsteps. Heavy, measured. The person upstairs paused directly above the bunker hatch. Silence followed. Caleb barely breathed. Atlas stared upward, muscles tight despite the injury in his shoulder. Then came a voice. Old. Female. Caleb? Everything inside him stalled for half a second. The woman spoke again, louder this time. "I know you're down there." Caleb frowned slowly. Not fear in her voice, exhaustion. Atlas's growl faded uncertainly. Caleb finally clicked the flashlight back on and climbed the ladder carefully, keeping one hand near the pistol until his head cleared the hatch opening. An elderly woman stood near the garage wall, wrapped in a dark wool coat dusted with snow. White hair escaped from beneath a knit hat, and one gloved hand rested against a cane. She looked directly at Caleb like she'd been expecting him for years. Atlas climbed up behind him and stopped immediately beside Caleb's leg. The woman's eyes softened the moment she saw the dog's bandaged shoulder. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered to Atlas. The shepherd didn't bark. That mattered. Caleb kept his distance anyway. "Who are you?" The woman studied his face for a long moment before answering. "Nora Byrne." The name landed immediately. Chief Walter Byrne's widow. Caleb slowly lowered the pistol, but didn't holster it completely. "How did you know I was here?" Nora glanced toward the hidden office hallway. "Walter spent 15 years waiting for you." Her eyes returned to Caleb. Small towns notice things. Wind moaned softly through broken windows while snow drifted beyond the bay doors. Neither of them moved for a second. Then Nora looked toward the bunker hatch. "So you found it?" Caleb nodded once. "And now people are trying to break in." A flicker crossed her face. "Then you found more than I hoped." She moved slowly toward the office hallway, with Atlas limping quietly beside her like he'd decided she was safe. Caleb followed. Inside the sealed office, Nora stopped at Walter Burns' desk and rested one hand against the worn surface. Dust coated her fingertips instantly. For a moment she looked less like a stranger and more like someone entering a graveyard. "He practically lived in this room after the fire," she said quietly. Caleb remained near the doorway. "You knew my parents." Nora closed her eyes briefly. "Knew them," she murmured. "Daniel Mercer rebuilt half this station with his bare hands." She smiled faintly at some memory far away. "Your father could fix anything except his own temper." Caleb felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. "And my mother?" Nora looked toward one of the photographs on the wall. "Evelyn was the calmest person I ever met." She laughed softly under her breath. "Women in town used to panic during emergencies while your mother stood there drinking coffee, like she already knew everybody would survive." Atlas settled beside the desk with a low groan, finally exhausted. Nora crouched carefully despite her age and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "You remind me of the dogs they used during search operations after the mine collapse." Atlas leaned slightly into her hand. First stranger he'd trusted since arriving in Black Hollow, Caleb noticed. Nora slowly straightened again and looked at Caleb more carefully. "You have Daniel's eyes," she said. The words hit harder than he expected, not because they were emotional, because they were specific, real. For 43 years, he'd existed like a disconnected piece of somebody else's story. Now suddenly, strangers kept recognizing him. Nora stepped closer to the desk and opened one drawer without hesitation. Inside sat stacks of old photographs tied together with faded ribbon. She handed the top one to Caleb. It showed a younger Daniel Mercer standing outside the firehouse, holding a toddler in a tiny winter coat. Caleb, 2 years old. His father's gloved hand rested protectively across his chest, while snow fell around them exactly like tonight. Another photo showed Evelyn sitting on the firehouse bumper, feeding Caleb crackers while firefighters laughed nearby. Another showed a handmade wooden cradle beside the station Christmas tree. "Daniel built that himself," Nora said softly. "Spent 3 nights carving the rails because Evelyn wanted something sturdy enough to survive generations." Caleb stared at the photographs silently. He didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until Atlas nudged his knee again, grounding him, always grounding him. Nora watched the interaction carefully. "Walter followed every foster transfer he could find," she said quietly. "Every county, every state file. But records disappeared after a while." Caleb swallowed once. "Why?" "Because he blamed himself." The office seemed smaller suddenly. Nora moved toward the journal resting open on the desk. Walter knew something was wrong before the school fire. Her fingers brushed the pages carefully. "So did your father." Outside, snow hit the windows harder. Caleb's pulse slowed into that dangerous calm again. "What exactly did Crowley do?" Nora looked at him for a long moment before answering. "The town was dying after the mines shut down. Mason Crowley's father controlled most of the contracts left." She paused. "People ignored things they shouldn't have because they were afraid of losing jobs." Her eyes drifted downward. "The sprinkler system at the school failed inspection 3 times. Caleb's jaw tightened. "And nobody fixed it." "No." Silence settled heavily across the office. Then Nora reached slowly beneath her coat collar. A thin silver chain set free. At the end hung a small brass key worn smooth with age. "Walter made me promise I'd keep this until you came home," she said. Caleb stared at the key. "Home." The word sounded strange coming from another person. Nora pressed the key gently into his palm. He believed you would come back eventually, she whispered, even after everyone else stopped believing it. Caleb looked down at the brass key resting in his hand, then back toward the hidden bunker beneath the station. Somewhere down there waited answers people were willing to threaten and bleed for. And somewhere in this dying mountain town, there were still people trying to bury the truth. The storm finally broke sometime before dawn. By morning, sunlight spilled across the mountains in cold silver sheets, turning the snowfields around Black Hollow into blinding white. Smoke rose from chimneys below town, while the firehouse stood dark and silent against the ridge. Caleb hadn't slept, neither had Atlas. The shepherd lay beside the office doorway with his bandaged shoulder stretched stiffly forward, eyes tracking every sound outside. Every now and then his ears twitched toward the garage, as if expecting the men from the pickup to return. Nora sat quietly at Walter Burns' desk, drinking coffee from an old station mug she'd washed herself that morning. The sight felt strange, like the firehouse had started breathing again after years underground. Caleb stood near the office wall, rereading Burns' journal while weak winter light filtered through dusty blinds. The key Nora gave him rested heavily in his pocket. "What does it open?" he finally asked. Nora looked toward the desk. "Walter never told me directly," she smiled faintly. "But he carried that key every day for 12 years. Caleb frowned slightly. 12 years. He believed if anybody found the records before you did. Her voice faded. They'd disappear. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Not alarmed, focused. The shepherd stood slowly and limped toward the far side of the office near an old filing cabinet bolted beside the wall. Then he stopped, stared downward. Caleb crossed carefully toward him. The filing cabinet sat partly recessed into the concrete wall itself, easy to overlook unless someone knew what they were searching for. He crouched lower. There, a panel hidden behind the cabinet. Small keyhole. Caleb looked back toward Nora. She nodded once. "That's it." The cabinet screeched against concrete as Caleb dragged it aside inch by inch. Dust exploded upward in gray clouds while Atlas backed away, sneezing softly. Behind it sat a heavy fireproof safe embedded directly into the wall. No handle, only the brass keyhole. The station seemed unnaturally quiet suddenly. Caleb pulled the key from his pocket slowly. His hands looked steadier than he felt. Atlas moved beside him immediately, pressing close against his leg as Caleb inserted the key. The lock resisted at first. Then, click! The sound echoed softly through the office. Caleb opened the safe door carefully. Inside sat 3 items: a thick document folder, a sealed envelope, and beneath both, stacks of bundled bank records. Nora covered her mouth quietly the moment she saw them. "Oh, Walter." Caleb removed the document folder first. Inside rested the original deed to Station 14. Property ownership transferred privately to Walter Byrne 14 years earlier after county closure proceedings. Paid in full. No liens, no county claim. Caleb frowned. The station never belonged to the county? Nora shook her head slowly. Walter bought it himself after the mines shut down. Used nearly all his retirement pension. Caleb looked back at the deed. Then suddenly the auction made sense. The county never sold the building. They only sold the unpaid tax debt attached to it. $1, not a purchase, a transfer. Walter Byrne had arranged for Station 14 to wait for him. Caleb sat down heavily in the old chair. Atlas rested his head against his knee again, always there when the weight hit hardest. Nora wiped her eyes quietly before motioning toward the bank documents. Caleb opened them next. Account ledgers, trust agreements, donation records stretching back decades. The numbers climbed higher page after page until Caleb finally stopped at the most recent balance statement. $412,763.18. His breath caught softly. The Harold Byrne Community Emergency Fund. Primary beneficiary, Caleb Mercer. He stared at the page in silence. Nora smiled sadly through tears. Walter never touched a penny for himself. The room blurred slightly for Caleb. Not from the money, from the idea behind it. Somebody had spent 15 years preparing for a man they might never find. A man sleeping in motels 3 weeks ago with $78 left and a German shepherd for company. Caleb swallowed hard and reached for the final envelope. His name appeared across the front in careful blue ink. Caleb Mercer. Atlas shifted closer as Caleb opened it. Inside rested a handwritten letter folded twice. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it beneath the office light. Dear Caleb, if you're reading this, then the station did what I hoped it would. It brought you home. Caleb stopped breathing for a second. Outside, wind moved softly through the pine trees surrounding the mountain. Your parents were the finest people I ever knew. Daniel Mercer ran into danger because he believed somebody had to. Evelyn stayed calm when everybody else panicked. Together, they saved 11 children the day the school burned. Caleb's grip tightened slightly on the paper. I tried to find you afterward. Lord knows I tried. But systems lose people when towns stop caring enough to look. Atlas rested his chin gently against Caleb's boot. Walter's writing continued. The town buried the truth because grief was easier than accountability. Crowley buried records. County officials looked away. Good people convinced themselves silence was survival. But your father knew the fire wasn't accidental, and he died trying to stop it. Caleb stared at the words while the old alarm tones from Afghanistan whispered faintly through the edges of his memory again. Burning buildings, collapsed roofs, men trapped inside places built by bad decisions. His pulse slowed into that same dangerous combat calm. The final lines shook worse than the rest. If I failed at anything in this life, it was failing to bring you home sooner. This station belongs to you now. Use it to protect people the way your parents did. And when the time comes, leave the light on for somebody else. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. The office stayed silent except for Atlas breathing beside him and the distant creak of winter wind through the old firehouse. Then Atlas growled, low, immediate. Caleb looked up sharply. A black SUV was climbing the mountain road toward the station, and this time it wasn't alone. 2 black SUVs climbed the mountain road slowly through the snow. Atlas rose immediately, despite the stiffness in his shoulder. A deep growl rolled through the office while Caleb folded Walter Burns' letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The old instincts settled over him again like armor. Observe, assess, do not react first. Nora watched the vehicles through the dusty blinds with tired eyes. That'll be Mason Crowley. The name hung in the room heavier than the winter air. The SUVs stopped near the chain-link gate below the station. Engines idled quietly while snow drifted across polished black paint. One driver stayed inside. The rear door of the lead SUV opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat and leather gloves too expensive for Black Hollow. Mid-50s, silver hair, controlled posture. Not a local anymore, but once maybe. Another man followed carrying a thin briefcase. Lawyer. Caleb noticed immediately how Mackensen Crowley paused before approaching the station. Not fear, recognition. The same look soldiers got when returning to old combat zones years later. Atlas moved closer to Caleb's leg. The shepherd's ears stayed pinned forward. Caleb stepped out into the garage bay before the visitors reached the doors. Cold mountain air swept through the opening, carrying the scent of pine and diesel exhaust. Mason Crowley stopped several feet away. His eyes moved briefly across the firehouse interior before settling on Caleb. You bought the station, he said. Not a question. Caleb nodded once. You've been trespassing inside private records. The lawyer opened the briefcase immediately and removed paperwork. We filed an emergency injunction this morning regarding ownership disputes tied to Station 14, he said smoothly. Given the condition of the structure and newly discovered legal complications. The station belongs to me, Caleb interrupted calmly. The lawyer offered a tight professional smile. That remains legally unclear,
Atlas.
growled softly. Mason's eyes flicked downward toward the dog's bandaged shoulder, then toward the hidden office hallway behind Caleb. You found Walter Burns' records, Mason said quietly. Again, not a question. Caleb stayed silent. Snow hissed sideways across the concrete outside. Finally, Mason stepped closer. My father spent years trying to bury this building because people in this town refused to let the past die. Caleb felt something sharpen inside him. Your father buried more than a building. For the first time, Mason Crowley's expression shifted slightly. The lawyer glanced between them uneasily. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out one copied document from the bunker files. Sprinkler System Failure Report. Signed by Mason Crowley Sr., he handed it over without a word. Mason took the paper slowly, read the signature, and went completely still. Wind moved softly through the pine trees surrounding the station. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Caleb reached into the folder again. Another document. Insurance transfer approvals after the school fire. Another signature. Another delay notice ignored. Mason's jaw tightened harder with each page. My father told me the fire was electrical, he said quietly. He knew the sprinklers were offline weeks before it happened, Caleb replied. Atlas watched Mason carefully without blinking. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside the SUV now. There are legal procedures for allegations of this nature. Shut up, Mason said without looking at him. The mountain fell silent again. Caleb studied the man in front of him carefully. No fake outrage, no performance. Just a man watching old lies collapse in real time. Then Caleb pulled out one final ledger from Walter Burns' records. Donation logs from the Community Emergency Fund. He opened directly to a marked page and handed it over. Mason frowned slightly while reading. Then his face changed completely. Frank Crowley, Emergency Assistance approved. Mortgage Relief Fund, winter of 1993. Further down the page, tuition assistance for Mason Crowley, approved by Chief Walter Byrne. Mason stared at the paper like he no longer recognized his own hands holding it. Snow collected slowly across his coat shoulders. My father never told me this. Caleb said nothing. The lawyer finally spoke carefully. Sir, perhaps we should revisit this later. Mason ignored him completely. My father lost everything after Mine 7 shut down, he murmured faintly. We nearly left town. Caleb nodded once toward the station behind him. Walter Byrne kept your family afloat. The words landed harder than anger ever could. Mason looked back toward the firehouse, toward the garage, toward the dark hallway leading deeper inside. The station he spent years trying to erase had once protected his own family too. His shoulders lowered slightly for the first time since arriving. When my father became county commissioner, Mason said quietly, he spent the rest of his life pretending weakness was something shameful. Nora appeared silently beside Caleb in the garage doorway. Mason noticed her and stopped speaking. The old woman looked at him with exhausted disappointment. Your father wasn't evil, she said softly. Just afraid. Mason swallowed hard. And afraid men bury things. The lawyer slowly closed his briefcase. I'll withdraw the injunction, he muttered. Nobody answered him. Mason stood there another long moment, staring at the snow-covered concrete. Then finally he looked at Caleb directly. What are you going to do with this place? Caleb glanced behind him. The old station looked different now. Not abandoned, waiting. He thought about Walter Byrne leaving lights on for someone who might never return. Thought about Atlas, bleeding on the garage floor protecting him. Thought about sleeping in motel rooms, scanning exits every night like the war had followed him home. Then he answered honestly, I'm going to keep it open. Mason stared at him quietly. For what? Caleb looked down at Atlas, then back toward the mountain road leading into Black Hollow. For people who don't have anywhere left to go. The wind eased slightly. Far below the mountain, evening lights flickered on across the valley town. Mason Crowley folded the donation ledger carefully and handed it back. Then, without another word, he turned toward the SUVs. The lawyer followed immediately. But before climbing inside, Mason stopped once more beside the station fence. "My father carried guilt like a second spine," he said without looking back. "Maybe that's why he wanted this place gone." Then he got into the SUV. The vehicles disappeared slowly down the mountain road through falling snow. Silence returned. Atlas finally relaxed beside Caleb's leg for the first time all day. Nora looked toward the station interior. "You really mean to save this place?" Caleb watched snowdrift through the open bay doors. For the first time in years, the answer came easily. Yes. And somewhere deep inside the old firehouse, it almost felt like the building exhaled. Winter loosened its grip on Black Hollow one slow inch at a time. Snow melted first along the road shoulders, exposing cracked asphalt and dead grass beneath. Then the pine trees began dripping steadily in the afternoon sun. Water rolled off the firehouse roof for hours each day, like the building itself was thawing awake after a long sleep. 6 months passed, and Station 14 stopped looking abandoned. The broken garage windows disappeared first. Then came fresh plywood walls inside the bunk room, new wiring, working plumbing, heat. Real heat. The first night, warm air pushed through the vents again. Caleb stood motionless beneath them, with both hands shoved into his jacket pockets while Atlas slept near the furnace room. For several seconds, Caleb closed his eyes, not because of the warmth, because the steady hum sounded nothing like generators overseas, nothing like armored convoys, nothing like war. It sounded safe. That was new. Every morning before sunrise, Caleb worked through the station with the same disciplined rhythm he once used preparing field clinics in Afghanistan. Clear task. Complete task. Move forward. Hank Dawson showed up almost daily, carrying tools and terrible coffee in stained thermoses. Sometimes they worked in silence for hours framing walls or replacing rusted pipe sections while old country radio played quietly in the background. Other people started coming too. At first, just curious townsfolk, then volunteers. An electrician rewired the garage lighting for free after seeing the memorial photographs in Burns' office. A retired nurse donated medical cots. Somebody left winter coats stacked outside the bay doors overnight with no note attached. Nobody in Black Hollow said the words out loud, but people remembered. Nora Byrne moved into the small apartment Caleb rebuilt behind the station kitchen sometime in early March. The first thing she unpacked was Walter's old coffee mug. The second was a framed photograph of Daniel and Evelyn Mercer standing beside Engine 14. Atlas supervised the entire move from the hallway rug. His shoulder healed slowly. The limp stayed. Cold mornings stiffened the leg enough that Caleb noticed every time the shepherd tried pretending it didn't hurt. But Atlas never stopped patrolling the station at night. Still checked the doors. Still paused at windows. Still slept facing entrances instead of walls. Some habits never fully left either of them. By April, the old bunk room downstairs had become temporary housing for homeless veterans passing through the county. Word spread quietly through shelters and VA offices across Montana. A former Marine stayed 2 weeks while waiting for disability paperwork. An Army mechanic slept there during a blizzard after losing his truck outside Helena. Nobody asked many questions at Station 14. That was part of why people kept coming. Caleb understood things most others didn't, like why some men sat facing exits automatically. Why sudden noises changed breathing patterns. Why silence at 3 a.m. could feel heavier than gunfire. Some nights he still woke reaching for weapons that weren't there. Still scanned rooftops, crossing parking lots. Still counted exits entering grocery stores. But now Atlas usually rested his head against the side of the bed before Caleb could spiral too far into old places, grounding him, same as always. One evening in late October, the first snow of the season returned to Black Hollow. Soft flakes drifted through the valley while yellow lights spilled warmly from the station windows onto fresh powder outside. The firehouse looked alive, really alive. Children from town painted holiday banners in the garage bay earlier that afternoon, while Nora handed out hot chocolate from the kitchen. Hank spent most of the day pretending not to enjoy himself while secretly fixing cabinet hinges nobody asked him to touch. Even Mason Crowley came occasionally now, never stayed long, usually delivered supplies anonymously before leaving. But one afternoon, Caleb caught him standing alone beside the memorial plaque outside the station, reading every name slowly. The plaque itself had become part of the town. Mounted beside the main entrance beneath the restored brass fire bell, it read, "Daniel and Evelyn Mercer." They ran toward the fire while others ran away. Below their names were the names of the 11 children they saved. People touched the plaque quietly when they entered. Like church, that night the snow deepened quickly. Wind curled through the valley, carrying the smell of pine smoke and cold iron. Inside the station, veterans sat around folding tables, drinking coffee, while a football game played softly on the television mounted near the kitchen. Laughter echoed through the garage bay. Real laughter. The kind Caleb hadn't heard inside himself in years. Atlas lay near the front doors, watching snowfall through the glass. Older now, slower, but still alert. Caleb stepped outside alone just after dark. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the concrete apron in front of the station. Above him, the mountains disappeared into low clouds, glowing silver beneath moonlight. The firehouse stood behind him, radiating warmth through every window. He looked up toward the old emergency light mounted above the bay doors. For years, it had stayed dead. Tonight it worked. Caleb walked back inside and stopped beside the main breaker panel. Hank helped rebuild months earlier. Voices drifted softly through the station behind him. Coffee brewing. Boots against concrete. Someone laughing near the bunk room. Home sounds. Atlas rose carefully and limped over beside him. Caleb rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. Then he flipped the final switch. Outside, floodlights mounted across the roofline burst alive one by one. White light flooded the mountain road, the parking lot, the falling snow, the entire valley below. A soft murmur rolled through the station behind him as people noticed. Then the old brass fire bell rang once in the winter wind. Clear, bright, alive. Caleb stepped back outside with Atlas beside him. Snowflakes drifted through the station lights like sparks floating upward from some invisible fire. The shepherd settled slowly near the garage entrance, front paws crossed neatly despite the limp, watching the road, guarding home. Caleb stood there silently with his hands in his coat pockets. No scanning rooftops, no checking shadows every few seconds, no waiting for bad news to arrive, just stillness, the kind that only comes when a person finally stops running. Warm light spilled from Station 14 across the snow-covered ground and stretched all the way to the road below, leaving the mountain dark everywhere else. And for the first time since Afghanistan, Caleb Mercer believed he might actually survive the rest of his life. The light from Station 14 stretched across the snow like a promise somebody had finally kept. Atlas rested beside the open garage doors. The town stayed quiet, the firehouse stayed warm. And somewhere in the mountains above Black Hollow, the wind carried the sound of that old brass bell one more time. If this story touched you, leave a simple 1 down in the comments. Not for the firehouse, not even for Caleb, for every veteran out there still fighting battles nobody else can see. And if you believe broken places and broken people can still find their way home, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there's another story waiting for you next.